Two world superpowers forming alliances against each other, espionage, paranoia, and the sense of déjà vu. Two alleged Chinese government agents were arrested for running a secret police station in New York in order to harass and intimidate Chinese dissidents who were speaking out against the regime. 34 others based in China were also charged. China strongly denies this, but this is not the first time alleged espionage has caused friction between Beijing and Washington in recent months. In February, the US shot down a Chinese-operated balloon, which it said was used for surveillance, a claim China also denies. Meanwhile, both sides are on a diplomatic mission to build alliances, with Chinese Premier Xi Jinping meeting French President Emmanuel Macron earlier this month, a historic ally of the US who was more than complimentary to his Chinese counterpart. Whilst Taiwanese leader Tsai Ing-wen's stopover in the US caused a stir in Beijing, leading to new military drills around the Taiwanese Strait. But how far will these tensions continue to spiral? And if they do continue to spiral, who is the stronger superpower? Should the US stay out of China's business with Taiwan? What is Xi and Macron's endgame with their newly blossoming bromance? Are China and the US heading towards a Cold War?
So let's get to it. Are China and the U.S. heading towards a Cold War? As always, we begin with our quick fire round, 30 seconds each to let your initial stance on the matter, and we pick it up from there. Martin Himmel, take the lead, please.
I wouldn't call it a Cold War. I'd call it maybe a lukewarm confrontation. Both China and the United States, let's not forget, it's not like the Soviet Union and the United States. China and the United States have very extensive trade, very extensive business. They both have large presences in each country. Yes, they are competing over influence in the South China Sea. Yes, they're competing over influence over Taiwan. Yes, they're competing even over influence in the Middle East right now, with China getting friendly with Iran and brokering relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So yeah. I would call it a competition.
Okay, fair enough. Professor Gong Jiong, your thoughts?
Well, I thought the term Cold War is mostly associated with the United States, but at least I think President Biden and Secretary of State Antony Blinken have already said that they don't want to be engaged in a Cold War with China. They are not engaged in a Cold War with China. It's supposed to be a competition. I think if it is a competition, both sides have to play fair and square. So I think, as the previous panelists have alluded to, there's extensive trade relationship between the two countries.
Professor, you're too polite. Stopping right on time. We will pick it up from there in a split second. Last but not least, Dan Perry.
The term Cold War, as far as I know, has no set definition, except that it feels like a war and there's no shooting and there's a sense of hostility. So the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union had tension, had alliances, had a fundamental ideological dispute, and of course had spying. The new one between the U.S. and the autocracies led by China has many of the same characteristics. So I guess I'll have to go with perhaps a chilly war.
Well, if it quacks like a Cold War, right? On that note, gentlemen, let's feel free to interact, of course, and let's begin with this espionage, cat and mouse game, if you will. Let it be the balloons or those Chinese secret police stations. Are we spiraling here? What's the end game here, Professor Jiong?
Well, I think the allegations of espionage is probably, lodged against any major power. I think the United States has been doing this. China's probably also doing this. All the major powers are doing this. Russia's doing this. UK is doing this. So I think it's not a big surprise that, these big powers all applying some kind of, espionage. But I think in this particular incident, we have to wait until the courts to come up with a verdict. Still, right now, it's still a charge, as the program has shown, Chinese government has come out and denied everything. So we have to give it a bit more time to see what really happened.
I have to say, I doubt there is. Go ahead, Mark.
Okay, so what we see with the balloon incident and with these police, this is not espionage. This is a bit of a game of public relations espionage. It's sort of like TV espionage. The real espionage is not what we're seeing, but is really taking place both in China and both in the United States. It's a game that's understood that's going on. When the balloon is flying over the United States, it's not a sophisticated way of seeing what's going on. And when some people are hassling activists here in the United States, it's not right, it's not good, but it's far from being serious espionage.
It's a version of it. I mean, I was going to say, I doubt there is a single viewer, including in China, if we have viewers in China, that necessarily believes the Chinese government's denials. But I would agree that the spying thing is overall a little bit of a comical issue. The lady doth protest too much. Everyone pretends to be shocked about the very thing that they both know about and clearly carry out themselves. Of course, China and the U.S. are spying on each other, whether in cyberspace or on the ground. In China's case, balloons. We also know democracies spy on their own citizens within their own borders. It's no big stretch to envision the Chinese spying on Chinese and harassing Chinese in other countries in the U.S. and Europe. If there's any real anger about this, I would say it's about the use of U.S. citizens who are Chinese background. Note that they were not charged with spying, but rather with acting as agents for a foreign government. And I would say that the ones with the most reason to be angry are Chinese Americans, in the same way that many Jews were unhappy that Israel used Jonathan Pollard in the 80s.
Well, that's an interesting point there. Maybe we'll get back to it later on. But in terms of the dynamics, we're seeing similar dynamics on other spheres. For example, the South China Sea. The U.S. As part of this joint military exercise with the Philippines is slated to sink this mock warship later on this month. And we're seeing it with the Taiwan question. All those tit for tat sort of back and forth. So is this how it's going to be until something flares up and we see a full-fledged war?
Well, that's the real. Sorry, go ahead, sir.
Well, sorry about this. I think there are a couple of separate issues here. Let me first respond to the balloon issue.
Please.
I think the Chinese government has come out and said that this is a balloon out of control. It's a lost balloon. Somehow it flew over the United States continent. So, it's supposed to be it's not a surveillance balloon, supposedly. It's supposed to be for meteorological purposes. But, this is debatable. But anyway, I also want to point out that having something flying over another country is something that the United States has been doing all along, at least 40, 50 years ago. I remember in the 1970s, you have these U-2 airplanes flying over China. As a matter of fact, I think there are 2 U-2 airplanes being shot down by the Chinese air defense system back in, I think, in the 1950s or 1960s. But anyway, let's set this thing aside. Let's talk about, the couple of issues you have raised. I think the issue about Taiwan is totally different. It concerns China's sovereignty right over Taiwan. It's an issue that, China is not going to back off. And I think the issue about Taiwan going towards independence is the most important driving force of all of this, this controversy. And I think in Taiwan's drive towards independence, it's not denied. It cannot be denied that Washington plays a very key role here. Even though the United States doesn't even recognize Taiwan as a sovereign state, it goes out of its way to threaten countries that are about to establish diplomatic relationships with China. So, certainly there's an element of encouraging and supporting Taiwan independence on the part of Washington.
Well, look, the People's Republic of China never controlled Taiwan. And, Taiwan, on the Formosa was went back and forth between different powers. I think the U.S. position, awkward as it undoubtedly is a sort of compromise between trying to allow democratic government to function unimpeded in a very tiny area of what can overall be considered China. Tiny, minuscule, and not offend China too much. And I have to say, what I've called the astounding gluttony of giants always amazes me. How on earth can China, a country that is the second largest landmass in the world, tied for it, really care that much about a little island? I have to think that beyond simply geographical hubris may lie the fact that Taiwan's being a vibrant and successful democracy somewhat puts paid to the notion that there's something in Chinese culture that is fundamentally, in antipathy towards liberal democracy.
Well, Dan, I'm quite positive that Jerusalem is even smaller than Taiwan. And look. Martin.
That's a good analogy.
Yes.
By the way, the gluttony of the Arab world that can't tolerate little Israel existing, or at least for years couldn't, is of a piece with that. As is Russia, the world's largest landmass, far bigger than China, insisting on expanding itself a little bit. Despite the horrific cost that this entails. It really is amazing.
Well, it's not about what all you have, but about the tiny pieces you do not. Martin Himmel, bear with me here. Does China have an American problem, or does the U.S. have a China problem?
I think it's a combination of both to some degree, but I think both leaders, President Xi and President Biden, they're very responsible and careful in how they approach this competition, let's call it. So I think both have conflicting dreams. Let's not forget, Taiwan, yes, is a bone in the throat for China, but it's also one of the, if not the biggest producer of semiconductors in the world. It's a very important strategic, I wouldn't call it an asset, but sure is a plus for the Western world. And if Taiwan was to suddenly be invaded by China, that would be a major problem in that sense. I think that what happened in the Ukraine has raised the whole issue of Taiwan and how much China is going to be aggressive about Taiwan. It's certainly flexing its muscles with all sorts of war games and maneuvers very close to the island. But I don't think it's going to violate the status quo at this stage because it has too much to lose. So,
Dan, what would be the casus belli of a war, a full-fledged war, if and when, of course?
Look, the U.S. could just bombard Taiwan's facilities to build semiconductors. I mean, or even cut it off. It has, enough energy to last maybe a week. But, I want to answer your previous question, Ellie. I actually think the U.S. has more of a China problem than China has a U.S. problem, in the sense that the U.S. is strangely more ideological. I think the U.S., elements in the U.S., actually are ideological about the fomenting of democracy elsewhere. They might have learned a few lessons in Iraq, but that is still a very strong aspect of America's worldview, whereas China, I think, is weirdly less ideological in the sense that their various initiatives to win hearts and minds in Africa and Pakistan and elsewhere are largely about trade, and they're not trying to turn anyone into a fellow communist dictatorship. By the way, in the way that the Soviet Union did. The Soviet Union actually tried to make everyone socialistic who was their ally. China doesn't really do that, and America is ideological and missionary about its democracy.
Well, that's fascinating, and a perfect segue for our topic after the break, the U.S.-China charm offensives around the world, if you will. So, gentlemen, you're staying with us. We're taking a very short break, and we get back with the rest of the summit. Do not go anywhere. We're here. Welcome back to the summit. Still with us, Dan Perry, Martin Himmel, Professor Gong Jiong, the All-Stars. And we're staying on topic, of course, but before we get back to the conversation, the U.S.-China charm offensive, as we've been starting to talk about before the break, across the globe, really gaining momentum. And the EU is now getting squeezed between those superpowers. Let's take a listen.
The European Union and China today have extensive and complex relations. How we manage these relations will be a determining factor for our future economic prosperity. This is why I do not see decoupling from China as a viable or desirable.
We are living in an era full of uncertainties, so we need to strengthen exchanges and coordination, and clearly and sincerely express our views so as to find common solutions.
Okay, gentlemen, simply put, is Xi winning the battle over Europe? Another quick fire round, and we pick it up from there. Professor Jiong, take the lead, please.
Well, I think this trip by French President Macron and also the European Commissioner von der Leyen is very productive. I think at least from Beijing's perspective, what Macron has said about Europe not being a vassalage state of the United States, something certainly very nice to hear from Beijing's perspective. I think Europe does need to have some element of independence, especially when it comes to the relationship with China.
Yeah, we'll pick it up shortly. Dan Perry, your thoughts?
Europe is clearly not going to adopt Chinese ways, but there's every sign that it's more inclined than the U.S. to adapt. We see this in the Scholz and Macron visits and various statements, and it relates to a post-World War II antipathy to conflict and ideological pliancy, and also to trade. Remember, China is the largest importer from the European Union, about $250 billion worth last year, double that of the U.S. So I think a lot of Europeans want to be practical, and they might ask, have the European people not suffered enough from the Russian energy fiasco?
Martin Himmel.
Let's not forget that Europe's second largest partner to export is China. And that's a lot of money, a lot of jobs, especially at a time of impending economic recession. And let's not also forget that China has great leverage over Russia right now. Russia really needs China to keep up its war in Ukraine. And the Europeans hope that they can make China go lower on that problem.
So you don't foresee, and gentlemen, obviously, let's feel free to interact. You don't foresee a scenario in which the U.S. is actually pressuring Europe, rather, to pick sides here, Martin?
No, I don't think that we see such pressure. I think the United States is focusing more on its Pacific allies, for instance, the Philippines, Japan, Canada, Australia, even the UK indirectly. They're trying to create some sort of naval alliance there to challenge China's efforts to create a hegemony in the South Pacific.
Well, and elsewhere in the world, of course, China, Gabon establishing a strategic partnership, Honduras reestablishing diplomatic ties with China. So what region will shape the next front of U.S.-China hostilities, I would say, Professor Jiong?
Well, the problem is that apparently Washington is driving NATO for another round of eastward expansion, which is very dangerous in my view. I think if you look at the recent statements from NATO headquarters, they're talking about establishing partnership in the Indo-Pacific region. And speaking of NATO, what's the name of NATO? Is North Atlantic Treaty Countries, right? Organization, and now they're talking about establishing some kind of a so-called security architecture, defense architecture in this region, and this is really something of great concern from China's perspective. And we know the consequences of an eastward expansion that we're witnessing right now. And the European countries have nothing to do with Indian Pacific, nothing to do with the Pacific region, and yet Washington is prodding these NATO member countries to send warships to the Pacific, and that's just a very dangerous development.
Yeah.
You touched on something very interesting here, the eastern expansion of NATO, which really relates to Russia. And I think that also relates to my answer to Ellie's question. The degree to which the United States is going to pressure its allies, in particular Europe, to choose a side, as you say, depends on other factors, including how the war in Russia goes, the war in Ukraine, rather. If it continues, and China continues to deepen its collaboration with Russia and becomes a complete strategic alliance, that's going to impact the answer to the question. If China really gets serious about lowering the boom on Taiwan, that will definitely impact the answer to the question. And also, I have to say, wild card is what happens in the U.S. presidential election in 2024, because there's a very big difference between the practical, slow-moving, cautious, globalistic view of the Democrats and what's likely to happen if Trump returns to the White House.
I think there's one China win that we're not really focusing on, and that's right here in the Middle East. I think that China pulled the diplomatic rug out of the United States when it got Saudi Arabia and Iran to resume ties. And that is a very big a win for China and its influence, and I think it's going to be more emboldened to actually try to mediate even here between Palestinians and Israelis. That doesn't mean it's going to happen. It doesn't mean it's going to win, but it clearly has got a bigger foothold in the Middle East now.
Or connecting all the dots and getting so emboldened that it will try to bring peace between Russia and Ukraine.
Well, I mean, certainly there's a big difference between what China is doing in the Middle East compared to what the United States is trying to do in the Pacific region. Here, we're not talking about establishing some kind of a new security architecture or establishing an alliance against any country. We're talking about peace. As a matter of fact, I would characterize what's happening recently in the Middle East as the great rapprochement, the greatest rapprochement. I mean, you're talking about, Saudi Arabia and Iran making good with each other. We're talking about diplomatic relations between Bahrain and UAE and Qatar, for example, and a whole list of Turkey with Egypt, and even Syria going back to the Arab world. I mean, all these developments, I don't see anything wrong, anything detrimental to the peace and prosperity of the region. Everything is good.
Peace and prosperity, not an accidental term there, Professor Jiong.
Exactly.
No, I have to say, though, I mean, bringing Iran back into the fold without exacting from Iran any price as regards its nuclear program or its general behavior in the region is not necessarily something that one could characterize as the promotion of peace, but rather perhaps the promotion of cynical power realignment.
Well, from Jerusalem's perspective, that's for sure. But, if you look from the perspective of Yemen, for example, that war is going to stop. Isn't that good? I mean, at least, there's not going to be many people being killed in Yemen. And also, I think, someone also previously mentioned the prospect of China playing a role to some extent between the Palestinians and Israelis. And I think that's also an interesting development in my view, although I'm not so much sanguine about the prospect of success, to be honest with you, but at least it's
I think we can agree on that.
Okay, gentlemen, we have less than a minute left, so what is next? Let me put it simply. Dan Perry.
I think what is next is, as we began in saying, a chilly war between these two powers, constant tit for tat, and a lot of nervousness in the months to come about China's moves regarding Taiwan.
Martin Himmel.
I actually think the focus will be on what China does with Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine. Will China give weapons? Will China support Russia militarily? Or will it be a passive sort of support? And I think that's a very important issue.
Professor Jiong, yeah?
My answer to this question is absolutely no. The Chinese government has come out and said it's not going to provide any weapons to Russia. Now, I think the distinction between a Cold War and a competition between the United States and China is really about these guardrails. I think both countries need to talk about the guardrails, to be careful about not sliding into this, very dangerous, slippery slope of, shooting at each other. It's absolutely important.
Well, the Third World War might begin on TikTok, after all, gentlemen. Martin Himmel, Professor Gong Jiong, Dan Perry, thank you so very much. Pleasure to have you on Global Eye.